I'm Chris from Play Comics, a show where we look at video games based on comic properties and how well they stick to that comic book source material. A part of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and the opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other wonderfully geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to episode 310 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss having websites for your show.
In this week's Better Podnerings, we talk about a timely Canadian social media update with news about TikTok.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we had a busy week as we round up a bunch of recent Discord conversations, including an L12 Brotherhood.
Lauren, start the show now.
This is Better Podcasting. We are hobby podcasters through and through, just like you. That's why we are different. We minimize the money talk so that you can focus on building a better podcast.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Better Podcasting. I am Steven, and I am pleased to say the one you actually want to hear is here at SP.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Hope you're having a great time with your hobby podcast, because that's what we talk about here is hobby podcasting. And we have had an exciting year. It's been a really productive year here on Better Podcasting. And we have just a few episodes left, and this is going to be a fun one today.
Absolutely. And I would just like to comment to everybody, if you have not checked out one of our live streams for this season, well, the clock is a-ticking, because we are recording this today on Friday, the 8th of November, 2024, and our continued chaos of live stream recording dates continue through to next week, which will likely be the last week of recording our show. Now, we do have two actual episodes after this one. One is our regular seasonal episode or season episode, and then that will be followed by our seasonal episode of our gear episode, but we're going to probably record them both next week because we got timelines, but you won't be getting those until subsequent weeks. So you got yourself a couple more weeks of Better Podcasting goodness before our season finale is here. And if you would like to chat with us while we do live stream, please come to our Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord. We do announce our recording time there when we have established that. And we've really only got probably one more opportunity this season for you to check that out.
All right. I like being checked out.
If you also would like to talk about some awesome podcast stuff with our community, you should come to the Discord as well. As SP mentioned in the intro, we had a lot of chatter this past week in our Discord, and that just continues all the time. Lots of people talking a bunch of different podcast topics. Great community there over in the Discord. That's betterpodcasting.com/Discord. Are you ready to code our website and talk about websites, SP?
I'm ready to talk about it, and I'm ready to watch you code it. When we started Better Podcasting, there were a couple of internet-based considerations that you pretty much had to have at the time. The first was, of course, a way to host your podcast and its RSS feed, two different things. Your podcast has to be posted somewhere in order for it to be dragged into somebody's podcatcher. But the second requirement was you needed to have a website. Stress on the needed. Wherein how you address the website portion was actually similar to how things are now. You could create a website independently, or you could potentially leverage your media host to take care of the website for you. If you're looking to build a website for your podcast in 2024, these are still the options in front of you. As we found out last season, it seems most media hosts are still providing the option of creating a website on their platform. Of course, how these look, what features are available varies drastically from media host to media host. You can go back to season 4 of Better Podcasting to really get our thoughts on that. But while the options for creating a podcast website remain essentially the same today, there has been a lot of evolution in listener expectations around a podcast website, including whether or not they're even looking for a website. So in today's episode, we're going to do an update of this topic on podcast websites, and we're looking at it from the lens of a hobby podcaster in 2024.
Let's begin by discussing the first question. Why may you even care about having a podcast website? Well, consider this. Your audience is checking out your podcast from a bunch of different locations. Some are listening to you through their podcast app of choice. Others may be watching you on YouTube. Some may be finding your podcast on a web experience, such as a podcast directory service that allows direct playback. Heck, if you're really effective with your promotions, some people may even be consuming your content over on social media. In the end, this means that your audience is really fractured. They're not turning just to one place to get your content. And that means that the information they receive varies significantly, especially when you consider that the different apps display content differently. And some of your audience may not even pay attention to the content that is in front of them in their chosen method of consumption. So when you choose to create a podcast website, you create sort of this neutral space that can cross over all of these different methods of consumption. And then within your podcast itself, you can point people towards this neutral space, your website. This allows you to easily add information and features that can support and enhance your podcast. Some examples of ways that you might support and enhance your podcast include contact information, host bios, other affiliated podcasts, some back catalog information, maybe other formats like your video format if you're primarily an audio show, additional reference material to support your podcast, maybe even live broadcasts or events pages, companion blogs, merchandise stores, media kits, links to the different podcast destinations, a place to post transcripts, maybe some financial support information, and link to community discussion space. These are all things that can help enhance your podcast.
It can also be a key way to control the brand of your website. If you're relying primarily on places on third-party listings, you're building your web presence dependent on somebody else's service. This can be very limiting to what you can do and cannot do with your web presence. What happens if they decide to retire a feature or worse, go away altogether? You might now be stuck without a useful web presence. So creating a website can also allow you more freedom of your RSS feeds hosting and your media hosting. When you develop a neutral brand or a landing site with your website, you are marketing a place that is outside of your media host that you can drive your traffic to. So if you end up wanting to change your media host, you know that if something goes wrong and it loses your audience in the shuffle, you have marketed a different platform that people can find you at. People can hop over to your website, find that you are still making content, and hopefully resubscribe or refollow as required. This also introduces the conversation to at least have a main URL for your show. Examples of this are betterpodcasting.com, legendsofshield.com, goodageek.com, or voicesofdefiance.com. That is a main URL, right? You can grab it and point it to wherever your main landing page is. We are going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later. Now, another reason you may want to consider having a website is that it can allow you to create a backup of your content. This one will depend on the chosen method for your hosting of your website, but if you are using a secondary service for your website, then you may be posting your content, such as your episode descriptions, on a secondary service. And if something happens to your media host, you have something that you can fall back on in order to get the information.
All right, so let's say that you do want to create a website for your podcast. For today's discussion, we're going to say that there's really three primary options that you're probably going to choose for your podcast website. The first is utilizing the website service on your media host that we mentioned. The second is using a company that specializes in creating websites for podcasts. And the third is creating a non-specific website, but adapting it to work for podcast use. And let's break these options down, first starting with the podcast media host option. If you did listen to that last season, First off, congratulations. That was a lot of content. But you did probably hear us regularly talk about the media host website offerings. That's because in today's market, media hosts do seem to offer some ability to create a website for your podcast. How this looks, what features are available, and how versatile this option, though, does vary drastically. In our experience, some of the media hosts offer top-notch website offerings, and others really looked like they kind of belonged out of the 90s. And others barely were even classified as a podcast website. So there was a lot of variance within this option. In any case, this can be one of the easiest ways to start yourself a podcast website. Because traditionally, this will mean that your podcast is really being done through an all-in-one solution. You've got your media host going, you've got your audio files put up there, and then you have your website spun off of that same service. It's really becoming an all-in-one solution. This can be a time saver for hobby podcasters since it's only one service that you really need to learn and pay attention to and maintain. However, a podcast media host website does come with some downsides, including offering often a lot more limited ability for customization, so it's a lot more rigid. It's generally seen as less neutral because, again, you're tying two services together and you're putting all of your eggs in one basket. You're putting your money to one company and hoping that company is going to be around, or you're going to lose a lot of your web presence, if not all of it.
Now, moving on, you can get a podcast website specific company. Now, personally, we don't have any firsthand experience with this. We did put a call out to see if anyone did have experience that they could share, and we didn't hear anything back, at least so far. But the summary is, it's an independent service you pay for that is meant for building a podcast website. And some examples of these services include Podpage, podcastpage.io, Podsite, and OnPodium. Now, as mentioned, we don't personally have any experience with these, and we're not one to speak from our butts on this whole thing. So while some other podcasts might sing all the praises of it just to hand you some affiliate codes, it's not going to be us. Instead, we're going to double down for our call to have our audience give us feedback to share their experiences with services like this. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to come back and provide some more information on them. Now, what we can say, though, is that if you're interested in these services, in doing just a cursory browse of the sites for these services, we were able to easily see a little bit about the features of the pages, how they look, and the pricing. Specifically, the pricing varied from about $12 to $15 a month for a basic tier, climbing higher based on the features you needed. And the pricing listing is often listed on an annual billing. So even though it's only like $12 or $15 per year, you have to multiply that by 12, and that's what you're going to pay once a year. Some common features that we did find include automatic podcast import. I honestly, I would hope so if it's a podcast specific page for that. Mobile optimized pages, the ability to use a custom domain, YouTube integrations. That seems, I'm going to pause here a second. This whole year has just seemed to be nutsoid over YouTube. YouTube this, YouTube that, YouTube everything. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just because I've been seeing it a lot, it just almost grates on you after a while. It's like, oh, yeah, of course, YouTube. So YouTube integrations. And the last one we noticed was the ability to create custom posts and blog posts. I think this is important because if you have a website, you should have the ability to do more than just podcasts, and that you could do a blog post for an announcement, if anything else. So there you go. And if you want to pay more, several of these sites offered elevated tiers to add more features. And here are some examples of those more features: multiple websites, AI features, mail tools, and additional integrations. In taking a look, we didn't see any trends for these elevated features. Some companies' elevated features were found in others' basic plans, and then vice versa. So it's not ubiquitous what extra features that you're going to get. And as an aside, we currently run betterpodcasting.com on its own hosting, and Steven is probably going to take our off season to explore these options a little more. So I want you to give a little insight there, Steven.
Yeah, in looking at these, I thought it was worth taking a look just to see if it was something that we could maybe trial for betterpodcasting.com just to give us some more experience. So I look forward to looking into it a little bit more. And if anybody knows of any that I should check out, please reach out to me so that I can put it on my list to take a look at. I would like to learn a little bit more. It might not work out long term for us, but I'd like to at least explore, seeing if it's something that we could maybe give a bit of a trial run.
Yeah, I'd be looking forward to that too, because the given websites, we've made no bones about it. We've switched most of our hosting over to Pinecast, and the Pinecast websites aren't exactly the greatest out there, in my opinion. And if I had a show that was really taking off, I'd want to place it on a better website. So I'd want to know which website to go off to. So Steve, I look forward to your research there. Obviously, we're going to probably do a podcast about what we find on it as well. So the last thing we will throw in here as a consideration is that these services are relatively new. As we've seen before in other areas of podcast services, sometimes they end up being more expensive than the company originally thought that they would be when they started out. So you got to watch that as price creep tends to happen, as we just experienced, for example, with StreamYard. There's actually a long-standing tradition in the general web hosting space for this sort of thing happening. It's not isolated to podcasts. So when you combine these two together, we would just caution that it remains to be seen how profitable these services will be long-term and how many will remain, especially when you consider the common theme throughout today's episode about how the podcast website is an evolving thing in 2024. So it's likely that we won't know for a while which hosts stay and which hosts leave. And by hosts, I mean like website hosts. And hopefully you don't lose your data if any of them do leave.
Now, the last option we'll discuss is creating a non-podcast specific website and making it work for your podcast. For example, utilizing a website service to host maybe a WordPress install. WordPress is a content management system, or maybe you're going to utilize a website building service like Squarespace. I think it's fair to say that this option has some roots in the past. We're not saying these aren't perfectly viable for options in 2024. Heck, we use them. But when we think about the essence of why we recommend hobby podcasters use media hosts for hosting their RSS feed over self-hosting their media, it's hard for us to track that same logic to something like running your own independent WordPress installation as being the top easy recommendation. We often recommend media hosts for hosting because it's going to make the process easier for an average person and remove a layer of that technical mumbo jumbo. Basically, give the hobby podcaster more time to just focus on developing their hobby podcast. So when a hobby podcaster decides they want to create an independent website for their podcast, it's adding an extra layer of complexity if they do have to figure out how to take a neutral website offer like WordPress and adapt it to work for podcasting. Think of it this way. Services like Squarespace and WordPress are used for a variety of different website needs. This could be a website for sports scheduling, or it could be somebody's online store. These things work on the same platform. And this means out of the box, these services aren't necessarily tailored or even lend themselves towards podcasting directly. These platforms are meant to be more versatile. This also means that the platforms might need some additional enhancements to really fit properly with podcasting. In this situation, we often hear the term plugins or add-ons used to describe the way that these enhancements are made to things like WordPress. This is because for a podcast website, traditionally you want readers or users of your website to be able to easily access information for the podcast itself, likely looking to get the episodes themselves and playing them directly from the same place that you host your media that is delivered through your RSS feed. While there may be some out-of-the-box solutions for adding media to something like a WordPress post, it's likely that you're looking to automatically have those posts imported into your website to save you some time, or at the very least, you want to make sure you're not just uploading a fresh version of the audio that isn't going to be in your statistics. No, you want to host it from your media host so that that traffic is tracked within your stats. For the podcast-specific services that we mentioned a few minutes ago, these features are included in a lot of these. And that's because these are must-have podcast features in order to have a successful business of creating a website for a podcaster. So you probably want to consider the same mind space. If they're adding these features to that dedicated podcast website service, you probably want to find a way to make it work for something like WordPress.
For example, on Better Podcasting's website, we do use WordPress, and some of the key add-ons that we've used to adapt it to be a podcast system include PowerPress. PowerPress is a plugin that is used to embed the media file into the website with a player on the site, the player being the important part there. We also use Elementor, and that is used to edit WordPress pages in a more user-friendly experience. And let me tell you, if you've been behind the scenes of a WordPress install, anything to make it easier and more user-friendly is better. We also use the Second Line Themes Bolden plugin. Now, this plugin is designed for podcast sites with features like the ability to add a list of shows to the site with their list of subscribes link or, follow links, the host information, and other show details. But it also provides our own podcast importer plugin made by Second Line. Now, this pulls the information from an RSS feed and adds the post automatically, including adding the media to the appropriate area to make it work with the PowerPress audio player on the site. We make mentions of these today, not as a recommendation, but just as some concrete examples on the things that we had to add to our WordPress install to get WordPress to work for us in our substantiation. With that said, you may be able to get away with not having some plugins, but it may require some more work. For example, we mentioned that we use PowerPress to make a player. With this, we end up having a field that we drop the MP3 file in, and it automatically makes the player. However, if your media host provides the embed code for your media file, you could just copy and paste that code into the post manually. Here's another example. With our Second Line Themes Bolden plugin, we use it and it adapts WordPress to have a proper structure for populating show information. One feature this provides is the ability for us to complete fields for subscribe links for our shows and makes them pretty on the site. Emphasis on the pretty. But in the end, once again, this makes it simpler for us by using the plugins. If you didn't want to pay for a theme like this, it would likely just create some additional work for you. You may have to create a static page to list these links that you manually update, and it may not look as pretty, but the information would be there. Now, a caution we have about the WordPress solution is that you often need to be aware of doing your updates on things like plugins and themes. We talk a lot about backups. Well, this is security related. There are some options now to auto update, but sometimes plugins go stale and there could be security vulnerabilities with them. As such, we'd recommend you to at least use the free version of a security plugin to keep an eye on these, such as WordFence. Or perhaps your chosen web host automatically takes care of these things if it's a WordPress package, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And I just want to say, we have noticed in the past couple of years, security vulnerabilities creeping into podcast-specific plugins as they just get old and need to be updated and present security vulnerabilities. We've actually seen it. So this is not just us saying it. And once these infiltrate your website, they could take the whole thing down. And then if your content happens to be distributed through your website, then your content would not be available in the podcatchers. So a lot of ifs there, but we have seen it happen.
So with all of that said, even with our cursory understanding of the dedicated podcast website services, this option, the neutral website option such as WordPress or Squarespace, is likely to be the one with the steeper learning curve. And it's going to probably require a little more creativity on your part. The last thing that we'll mention in the category of something like WordPress is that if you are going to do this, you'll have to pay for a web host to host WordPress. This can often be done on a monthly basis or an annual basis or even greater terms. But the thing is, you'll have to actually go out and find a package that works for you. And there's a couple different ways that you could do this. You can go and just get a general web hosting option and then install WordPress on it. Or there are some web hosts out there now which are tailoring towards offering dedicated WordPress hosting plans to help simplify the process of that. In any case, this is an additional charge that you'll have to take a look at. And sometimes the charge to host on a WordPress optimized platform will be the same as if you choose a different option, or sometimes it might cost you more. Basically, to summarize these last couple points, the idea of building your podcast website on an independent website service is going to be easier if you select something that is dedicated for WordPress. And this is an option that makes things a little easier than even they were just a handful of years ago. So you might hear some people in the podcast space talk about all the downsides of WordPress. Well, take a listen. There might be some merit there, but also take a look and compare it to what you actually see online now, because sometimes there might be some dated information in the space around how you set up a WordPress site if you choose that. But we're not going to get any more technical about this because there's a whole bunch of other tech talk we could discuss about web hosting, but we're just not going to do that. That would take too much time. Instead, let's talk a little bit about some recommendations we have.
Yeah, so we have some recommendations when making your podcast site, no matter what option you choose for making it. Now, let's get this out of the way. We're not going to discuss design recommendations. We're not here to discuss these things, at least not today. Although we do have some experience in creating and maintaining sites, we are not full-time web designers or graphic designers. There is a plethora of good materials on the internet to provide design tips. These are probably worth seeking out, as they will likely cover areas such as ease of use, accessibility, catching a viewer's eye or attention, avoiding user information overload, and just general mobile to PC web design issues to make your website that is functional in both. But we aren't going to get into these specifics, as that in itself could be an entire podcast episode. Plus, we also recognize that a good portion of our audience just want to create the website, and they may see it as a functional requirement version of a project of passion. Perhaps their primary passion is the podcast itself. Yeah, I fall into that category, and I know a bunch of you do too. But also, web design preferences vary by needs, by features, by experience, by money, and also even things like where your audience is located regionally. Yeah, website design varies across the globe, so you have to pay attention to that as well. Once you start traveling worldwide and you have to access websites that are local, you start to see the trends of the specific area that you're in. And even, Stephen, I would say there is slight differences between Canadian websites and American websites.
Yeah, Canadian websites taste a lot better.
What we will say on the design front is that when creating your website, we'd recommend you keep your podcasts at the forefront of your mind. Can people easily find their way back to your podcast? If you're listening to this episode, it's likely that you've chosen to build a podcast website to complement your podcast, meaning that your podcast should still be the focal point. Now, if you bury your podcast details way down deep into your website, then somebody who does find their way to your website may not transfer directly to your podcast because they see a bunch of other stuff, but they don't actually see the podcast. And don't rip off other images. Obviously, we've advocated this all the time for creating your podcast art and everything involved with your podcast. But sometimes people think that it's just a website and you can go and use copyrighted material. Now, using copyrighted material on your website is bad, unless it follows the laws and regulations of your specific region. There are lots of stories out there of people being sent cease and desist notices, or you are charged money in fines for using copyrighted material on your website. There are companies out there that specialize in enforcing copyrights for copyright holders. There are companies that scroll websites using AI looking for this sort of stuff. So don't be bad about this, and make sure that you stay within the bounds of everything. Stephen, I'll go back to when I was doing some geeky blog posts and I wanted to use a lot of just pictures. Like I did a geeky blog post once on all of the different Enterprises out there, because of course Enterprise for Star Trek, but there's a lot of ships out there called Enterprise. So I did a blog post on that. And there were some that I legit had to go back to somebody that authored a piece from 50 years ago. And the person had passed on, but the rights had transferred to their kids. So I actually had to get the permission of the kids to use that image on the blog post. Otherwise, there would have been a cease and desist. So I did that before I published the blog post, which is always beneficial, right? To do it beforehand. So this is nothing new, but now that AI is here, it's going to get even worse.
Now, moving on, although we won't be giving any specific design recommendations, we do want to talk a little bit more about the broader suggestions we have for the content and features that you may want to include, just to expand a little bit on what we mentioned earlier. And the first thing is, of course, access to subscribe or follow information for your podcast. Keep this in the forefront. You're trying to make sure anybody that stumbles over to your website is able to get to your podcast. How do they do that easily? You definitely want to have a section that is about information for your podcast, so people who are on your website can see what it's about. You want to have a section about contact information, including social media. Sort of piggybacking on last week's episode, social media is very fractured right now in 2024. And if you can make things a little bit easier for your audience to be able to follow you somewhere through your website, this can be a huge, huge feature of using your website in an effective manner. A great thing that you could add is bios for podcast hosts. You just don't really have a way to create bios for your podcast hosts currently in the RSS feed. So this is going to be a great place to do that. And if you're comfortable with the bios, maybe include a photo of yourself, because this can sort of help create an audience connection with the podcast voices. Put a face to the voice. If you can, find a way to include your back catalog. Again, if someone's coming over to your website, how can they hear about the back content or see if they want to check it out? Make it accessible for them there. Perhaps you can pin some content as well that might draw people in, such as some standout episodes or some highlights that you think, okay, this is going to get people in the door. And if applicable, of course, some affiliated podcasts. There's a lot of podcasters that do multiple podcasts. And if you've got a podcast website, why not try to cross-pollinate a little bit by using that affiliated podcast section if you can build one? Credits should be on there, such as writing credits maybe, and other miscellaneous links, like a network if you're a part of that, or somewhere else that you're trying to link to. If possible, can you create an easy way to submit feedback? Some people would argue contact forms. This is definitely a thing that can still happen. Some would say just an email address. Everyone has their own preference, and I think that's going to be an area that's going to be tailored based off of your own personal preference. I like both. I see people who have strong opinions about both, so I don't know, do what you want on that one. And then, of course, if you have any support or donation or subscription information, again, how are people easily finding this if they're having their audio podcast or even video podcast delivered directly to them? That stuff's probably not easily accessible to them. So put it on your website. Might as well have it linked there.
Yeah, some other things that you might consider as design elements for your show. We've talked about it before, but I just want to foot stomp this here. I mentioned that because Stephen loves it when I use that term.
Love it.
I want to foot stomp additional reference material to support your podcast, because you can't reference it in the RSS feed itself if you have like a PDF or a picture or something like that. If you're doing live broadcasts, it's great to have a landing page on your website for people to go to that they could just pick it up. Now, onus is going to be on you to refresh that and make sure that you code the website for your specific live broadcast. And if you're going to have an embedded chat, there's the whole thing about combining chats and stuff like that. But at least if you have a landing page of where that is, and that would direct you to wherever you're live broadcasting your recordings, then that is a page. If you have some sort of event, say you're going to a con and you're going to have a panel, saying you're just going to do a meetup somewhere, say you're doing an educational series and you want to have those 4 or 5 events grouped together somewhere and notification of there. We've mentioned companion blogs before. I mean, I just talked about the fact that I did some geeky blogging back in the day of the ship's Enterprise. If that will help your content and you want to put some companion information out there just in written form, that would be something that you would want on a website. This we don't do on Better Podcasting or Gonna Geek, but if you happen to have merchandise or a storefront that you want to sell from, having a website on your a page on your website to at least link over to wherever that store is, if you don't actually have it on your site, that's probably good. Media kits, that is also probably pretty good, and not just for selling advertisements. Say you want to get a media pass to a con somewhere like Dragon Con or C2E2 or something like that. Having media kits that you can point back to is a bonus to say that you're actually on the verge of being a full-fledged journalist. And as a hobby podcast, that's actually a big thing. Something that's big into the space this year is transcripts. And if you want to create your own, which we don't necessarily advocate here because Apple and Spotify do it for us, but if you want to do that on your own, having a place to post those transcripts on your website would be good. And as Stephen mentioned before, a link to your community discussion space, whether that's a Discord channel that we use or Discord server that we use or anything else, having a link to that or say you can join, click here, I think that is very beneficial and a gateway. As you can see here, there's just a ton of information that if somebody wants to learn more about your podcast or wants to be more involved in your podcast, then the website is where you would need to post that information and have it available for everyone. Now, in addition to just having the website, I mentioned it before, Stephen, but it's very important, and we've talked about this since day one. Get yourself a domain.
Absolutely. This is one of the top recommendations that we do have. And that is your .com or your .net, your .ca. Essentially, it's a short, quick URL, a thing that somebody can put in easily to get to your website. This is going to be an annual fee, so you need to budget as such. In the year 2024, the ability to tell people about where to easily find your podcast website is really important. You have to easily be able to get people to go over to your website. This is really important. If you don't make it easy, it's going to be unlikely people will check out your website from your podcast, and a domain allows you to do that. This is really, really important in the year 2024 because it's likely that people have short attention spans or they're not going to easily be familiar with something like your media host. So if you are trying to point people to a URL on your media host, like mypodcast.mymediahost.com.org.ca, they're not going to retain that. The reality is they're not. But if you can get a domain that's short that can redirect them over there, that solves the problem. Also, don't make it too hard on yourself. Everybody's skill sets are different for building websites, and as a hobby podcaster in the year 2024, you probably don't need to put a lot of manual work into your website if you don't want to. Might there end up being some duplicated efforts each time you post? Yes, but there might not be if you use the tools that are available to you. Your episodes might automatically be scraped from your podcast into your website. How much manual work you do on your website is going to really depend on your level of comfort. But we'd encourage you to at least remember that only a percentage of your audience will be using your website. Wait a minute, I know what you are saying right now. You just spent a lot of time telling me why websites are important, and now you're just telling me that only a small percentage of your audience will use your website? Well, yes, we are telling you that, but a website is still important for the small percentage of your audience that wants or needs one, and the benefits do outweigh the detriments. So yes, you should have one, and we'll come back to this in a little minute. As such, just like with things like social media, it should only require a portion of your time. You have so many different things to think about as a hobby podcaster, and sinking countless hours into your website every day or every month or every week just might not be the best use of that time.
Just like you are not going to make it too hard on yourself, don't make it too hard on your audience either. A website can be a great support tool for your podcast. It can help provide access to content that a traditional RSS feed podcast app or video service can offer. However, if you are using your site as a way to complement your podcast, you don't want to risk detracting your audience. Think of it this way. Your audience is listening to your podcast. Your podcast is served to them directly to their listening device. It's an easy process. They hit subscribe or follow, and now they are spoon-fed your content. If you're going to have people go to your website for additional content, they should try to make it easy, or you should try to make it easy for them. If they are fighting to navigate multiple pages just to find the content that you referenced within your podcast, you're probably going to lose a fair percentage of your audience from doing that. That reduces the value of having the website to begin with. But it can also negatively impact your podcast. People have chosen to subscribe or follow to your podcast as chosen form of their preferred medium. Wherever they're actually consuming your show, that's where they're subscribing from. When you start to break from their preferred method, it negatively impacts their experience. So if you're making people go to your website too much, it breaks from their chosen medium and they might turn it off. So you shouldn't make it too hard on your audience so that your website supports your podcast rather than replacing it. If you can do short links, that can be helpful. For example, I love this. I've loved from the day one that Stephen made this possible. We say go to betterpodcasting.com/310 for this episode that you're listening to now. This is something that we can communicate by audio, place in our description, and it's relatively easy for people to remember.
All right, so moving on to our next recommendation, backups, because we would recommend you have backups. Unfortunately, we have seen podcast services come and go, and also we've seen web hosting services come and go as well. Sometimes this is with no notice, so we would encourage you to have some form of way to back up your content if possible for future use. If you're using a specific podcast website, this might be a little harder or require a little more manual work unless they incorporate a way to neutrally back it up. Think of this. If the web service that you choose goes away tomorrow, what is going to be your fallback method to get all of that content? Hopefully you have a way that you can restore that, even if it requires some manual work. But if your chosen method does allow backups in any form, we would encourage you to take them regularly. Work it into your monthly routine. Yes, that might mean that you're running the risk of losing a few weeks worth of content, but it is something that you might find the monthly backup process is the sweet spot for your time management. And in situations where you are limited to the backup abilities, consider what you're uploading to your website and try to keep local copies of that content. Then you've got access to that if you ever need to re-upload later. On a similar note, if you aren't using a neutral platform that can be backed up, perhaps consider something like a notepad file or a Google document or a Word document with the copy of any unique posts. SP mentioned earlier about making blog posts. Well, if where you have those blog posts went away tomorrow, all of that hard work that you put into that is potentially gone. You probably back up your podcast itself. Think of the extra creative content like blog posts in that same light. You put time and hard work into it. We don't want to see you lose that hard work.
And I will say that when I was redoing the Legends of Shield feed a couple of months ago, I did in the reverse. I did actually use some of the web postings that were on Gonna Geek to recapture some of the descriptions that I knew had been corrupted on the feed. So it works both ways. And if you have a website that is reflective of your content, you can definitely use that for your podcast and vice versa. Now, lastly, breaking away from all this tech talk, This is arguably the most important part of building a website. Use it. Not only is it important to make your website and have it up to date, it's also important that you reference it within your podcast. Now, if you create a website and then let it go abandoned, anyone who happens upon your website may think your podcast is dead. This happens with social media accounts as well. But also, if you're going to make the decision to create a website and then spend the time on maintaining it, don't you want to try to see it get used? Yeah, there are some people who find your podcast website through search engines, but the bulk of your meaningful traffic is likely going to be people who are choosing to access it. As such, you should promote it on your podcast. For example, here we often tell people that they can find our back catalog and spin-off shows at betterpodcasting.com. Or find our social media at betterpodcasting.com/contact. By the way, Stephen, I did check that before we went live on this podcast. So congratulations for having that up to date.
Woo! I passed the test.
You have to find a way to naturally work it in your content if you want to try to get people to use that. How you do that and what fits your podcast will depend on your podcast. But if you do want people accessing your website, you have to remember that repetition is going to be the key. People may not check it out at first, but if you repeat it enough, it may start to stick. And as a bonus, if you really want to try to draw some of your audience to your website, try creating a unique offering that draws them to your website, maybe some of those blog posts that we were talking about before, and then make sure your audience knows about it in your show.
So now, with all of that said, everything we've been through, here's the question, getting back to what we sort of teased about 10 minutes ago, maybe 15. Do you even need a podcast website in 2024? Well, technically, no. We want to acknowledge that we wasted your time today. Just kidding. Jokes aside, we do want to acknowledge that you actually don't need a website. We mentioned earlier that the pros outweigh the cons, but technically you don't really need one. There are definite benefits, though, to having one. But we do strongly feel we'd be remiss if we didn't take a few minutes at the end of today's episode to at least acknowledge there's a case to be made that you can get away without having a dedicated website if that is going to really negatively impact your ability to podcast. Now, what makes it possible in 2024 to potentially not have a website? Well, let's start with the user consumption habits. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of your audience is likely getting your show through their app of choice, and many of these platforms have done a good job of presenting your content in a much more visually appealing way than once was many years ago in podcasting. Heck, even in our media host quest, we determined that out of the box, there are some media hosts that are just making a website automatically for people that looks pretty darn good. But another variable that we wanted to mention is that there is the attention span factor that might play into your weighing of a podcast website. The idea of moving people from your podcast over to your website is one that has been a unique challenge for a while, but the modern trends in 2024 are making this more and more difficult, and it needs to be called out right now. This trend of people wanting to be spoon-fed their content is only getting larger. People are only wanting to stay on their platform of choice in greater numbers. In 2024, it is harder to get people to use that website, and we wanted to call that out specifically. It's important as hobby podcasters that you know some of the challenges that you're going to face with the different aspects of podcasting, and trying to get people to move from your podcast to your website is going to be a heavy lift. That makes it less important than once was a few years ago of having that website. But again, some will notice if you don't have it. We also want to acknowledge that some of the benefits that come with the website might not be used as much in the current era.
Only a short while ago, podcast listeners might go to your website to find your specific location on the platform of choice. For example, I want to go find this person on Google Podcasts. But many of these platforms have faded into oblivion. See why I just mentioned Google Podcasts there? Because it's faded and gone. Okay. Anyway, searching on these platforms have gotten better. And once again, people are likely just looking at their chosen platform to find a podcast, and let me be specific. You could be on Spotify, and that is where you want to find your content. You could be on YouTube, and that is where you want to find your content. So that's what we're talking about, your specific app of choice that you're consuming your content on. It could be social media. There is still a base of users that might be turning to your website to find certain information, including your direct RSS feed URL. But there are many others that are just opening the app that they know that they can get the podcasts on and then searching for their podcasts right there. Now, think about this. Spotify paid a ton of money to make Spotify exclusive podcasts about 2.5 years ago. And they fought with getting people to move towards a platform that was not their platform of choice in order to get those Spotify exclusives. Didn't work out so well for them. I mean, it probably worked out a little bit, but it didn't work out enough to keep those exclusive podcasts 2.5 years later. There's similar logic to be had of whether people will even be trying to find your website or try to find where you are found on their platform that they have settled into. So lots of things up in the air about how people actually find your show.
So in summary, there are a lot of different ways that you can create a podcast website, and there are a lot of features that you can choose from when making your website. But in 2024, it's easier now than ever to develop that podcast website if you want to, especially a comprehensive website that's made for podcasts. That's a big evolution. However, you do need to consider that maintaining a website in any capacity will require some level of additional work. Even if you choose your media host site, the simplest way that you can do this, a successful version will take some form of manual work outside of what you would be doing if you weren't doing a website at all.
This means that you should be honest with yourself. How much time do you want to spend on your site? What are your technical skills in maintaining a website? Do you enjoy this area of development? Or for some, expanding their online offerings is a way to increase their fun or their skills for their resume? And how much will this complement your podcast to begin with? Depending on these answers, it will hopefully guide you to the right choice for how you want to build your podcast website. And once again, hopefully use it. After all, what's the point of having a podcast website if it's just filled with tumbleweeds? Unless, of course, your podcast is actually about tumbleweeds.
All right, let's get to the Better Podnerings this week, which is a short one. It's a single discussion point today. We knew the website talk was going a little bit long, and it's because we can only offer you a little bit of time to recuperate after we talk about Canadian news.
Yeah, I saw this in the document, in the show doc, and I was like, oh yeah, this is entirely up Steven's alley.
So the summary is that breaking this week, the government officials have decided that basically the Canadian federal government has ordered TikTok to shutter its Canadian operations. Canadians will still be able to use TikTok, but there has been a mandate down from the federal government to have TikTok shut down its Canadian operations. Now, why did I want to bring this up? Well, I wanted to bring this up because I think it's sort of a bit of a statement of the evolution of social media right now. We are in a big state of flux. And this is something that this is causing TikTok, huge booming platform, lots of Canadian content creators, lots of Canadian TikTok users, to shut down its Canadian operations. Now, there is some differentiation that I wanted to bring up between Canadian TikTok creators and some TikTok creators around the world. Canadian TikTok creators weren't necessarily making a lot of direct money from TikTok because the thing called the Creator Fund does not exist in Canada. So there wasn't this pool of money dipping in for content creators to dip into. So it wasn't, I guess, a monetized platform as much for Canadian content creators as it was elsewhere. But people were still creating content, probably making money through elsewise. And obviously, these content creators will still have the ability to create content. And at the moment, users will still be able to consume TikTok content. But I do want to bring up the question of what will happen to the Canadian TikTok experience. Obviously, TikTok decided that they needed to have offices in Canada for some reason. What was that reason? I don't know. I don't do their books. I don't know anything about it. I have no idea. But there's some reason they felt they needed to have a physical presence in Canada. Was it things like marketing? Was it other business-driven reasons? Once they're forced to get out of Canada, what's going to happen with the way that the TikTok app is used within Canada? Is it no longer going to have an experience that is tailored towards Canadian content for Canadian TikTok users? Will it change or will it remain the same? I can't help but think that if they invested in actually having physical locations, there will be some form of detriment to removing those, even as much as maybe reduced revenue. And if that's reduced revenue, I just could see there being a negative impact on the Canadian TikTok experience. So we'll see what happens with this, but I wanted to bring it up because it is very timely with what we were talking about just a couple of weeks ago about social media and the way things are evolving. And as a Canadian who uses TikTok for consuming content, not creating content, but has considered creating content, it makes me put a little pause and want to see how things maybe shake out a bit.
This is a fascinating subject. I'm not going to get into any of the political sense of anything, but I will dance around it a little bit. So why would any government have concerns over social media that has its origins, may or may not be owned, but has its origins within another country that might be considered a global competitor, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is aggregation of personal data. Now, I know there's been a lot of things that have been put in place to protect that, but at the same time, through aggregation of information, you never know exactly what somebody's going to be able to get when. Matter of fact, some of the things that I've seen on a company that provides this sort of information to grocery stores, it almost makes me want to throw up in the amount of privacy that we don't have. So that's one concern. And just if you have never thought about this in the way of concerns, that's what I'm talking about here. You might be well versed in it, but for our portion of our audience that just loves to use any certain social media, no matter what it is, and that is going through this, I just want to throw out some of the considerations that is being thrown out there. Another consideration is the fact that it can control the flow of information through algorithms, and it can repress certain information and it can lift up certain information, right? So through that, you can consider undue influence on a country's population. So is that important to a nation or not? How can other players in the global competitor that is the origin of the app, how can they actually do it? And for the apps that originate in America, it's the same thing across the board, right? Across the ponds or whatever. So you have to consider those factors as well. And as Stephen mentioned, there's a monetary aspect to all this. And the fact that Canadian creators were not being able to be paid through this app is, if what I gathered correctly through this, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'm getting out of this.
No, that's the case. It's kind of the common joke if you saw Canadian creators is that they didn't make money on TikTok. No matter how
I don't have TikTok, so I wouldn't know. I don't really pay attention to it that much. But so if that's the case, you want your individuals that are actually applying their creative time and talents to be able to be compensated for it, because it's truly being seen worldwide, or if the algorithm allows it to be worldwide. So your people that are being engaged should be compensated for it. So maybe not a national security concern, but maybe a national economic concern. So those are the considerations that I can see when it comes to any social media, whether it's TikTok or whatever else out there. So if you just want your app of choice, in this case, TikTok, if you just want it and you like using it and you want to see your favorite creators on it and that sort of stuff, there are broader considerations to this sort of thing that didn't exist 10 years ago. They didn't exist 20 years ago. When I grew up, they didn't exist at all. And to have a person that's grown up in the modern age. Like my kids were of age around 10, 12-ish when the mobile phones, the smartphones first came out. That was really the impetus of all this stuff. And they always have had it available. Stephen, your kids have always had it available. So you have people that didn't grow up with this trying to make policies to protect the younger generations that might not want to be protected or might not realize why they need to be protected. So like I said, it's a fascinating subject. I'm not going to be pro or con of any of this. It's just these are some considerations, and it can induce a great discussion, which we're not going to have right now.
The last thing that I want to throw in related to this is bringing it back to the hobby podcaster, because as hobby podcasters, you might not be looking to monetize a lot of your stuff. If you're like us, it might not be a priority. So you might not be affected by something like this. If you're a Canadian podcaster, if the algorithm remains the same, you might just be carrying on and carrying on. But it might also shift what is an effective social media if the algorithm does change. You might have been having a lot of success promoting your podcast content through TikTok clips or something, and now all of a sudden you see your numbers drop off or something. So I guess we'll wait and see.
Yeah, that's the practical application for podcasters, but it could be relevant to whoever uses the platform.
This is where we here at Better Podcasting turn the show over to you as we run through some of your feedback. We call this segment Better Podback.
Let's kick off the Better Podback today with a piece of feedback we got while we were recording this in regard to websites. Damien the DM said, got a whole featured podcast and featured artist page on my website. Also a section to highlight the artists who we've commissioned work from. So that's how Damien uses his podcast website and offers additional features, unique features on the website.
Yeah, I know for him, since his is a playthrough podcast, he has mentioned before that he puts maps up for his listeners to follow what's going on there. And that's just an example of an image or interactive website out there so people can understand the laydown of what's going on in the story. A lot of books have maps in the front, but Lord of the Rings has maps in it. So yeah, it's very similar there. So Damien, you rock, man. We also got some feedback earlier before we started recording from a lot of people, including Johnny Pennington, who said gear shows are always the most fun. Okay. Yeah, they are for us. Yeah, but you realize not our entire audience likes gear shows, so we're sensitive to that.
On the L12 front, Damien the DM said, L12 gang! So he is all excited for me to maybe return to the L12, perhaps.
I think a lot of people are, so we'll see how that plays out. On the social media front, DC Dave commented and he said, and finally, loved the social media episode. As I mentioned, I'm about to launch my first podcast, so I've been carefully crafting the social media channels, securing usernames, email addresses, platforms, auto-posting techniques, etc. I learned some things, got some great insight, and you validated things I was thinking about it. Thanks again.
On the chapter markers front, Scatmaker came in and said, I'm glad to hear that the chapter markers plugin for OBS has been working well for you. So much so that you decided to buy another Stream Deck? Elgato, send the check. Oh, please do.
We'd have to disclose it, within laws and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't think we'd be against it. But so far, we've minimized sponsorships by companies. Yeah, it's just how we've been rolling here.
Picture this, and for the audio listener, I will describe for a second here. So as we record this right now, I have behind me a wall of microphones, which is actually a green screen, but used to be a real thing. And I've made it very clear that one day I need to remove that green screen and replace it with something. If I had nothing but Stream Decks behind me that I actually had to turn around to use while we were recording, how awesome would that be?
Dude, I've been watching a lot of old movies, like airplanes and airplane disaster movies and stuff like that. And the 747 cockpit, the original 747 cockpit from like the 70s and early 80s that had all the manual fuses and switches in it and stuff like that. Man, that's what I wanted to do when I was young. Is I wanted just to be in a cockpit to flip switches and know what switches did what and stuff like that. So yeah, I get what you're saying. I would say, Stephen, that we would be solely owned by Elgato at that point.
And on the note of chapter markers, Waffles said, now, how about chapter markers in Reaper? Now, I haven't tested this yet, but I believe it likely will work because the chapter markers that are in OBS, I know there was reference to them being a standard, like that would work in VLC or something. So I'm pretty sure this has got to be like a standard chapters marker thing that is in the file. I don't know for sure, but I do know that I saw reference to it being able to be pulled into multiple platforms. So I'll have to try it. I'll have to download the Reaper trial and give it a shot and see what happens when I pull in the video file.
And our finally topic that we're going to discuss today is Rodecaster Pro 2 issues and non-issues. Damien the DM piped up and he said, maybe it's a Mac OS issue, but WVFRM, which is a show, has issues with their Rodecaster 2. Now, he put in a YouTube link. I went to the link. I actually watched. Stephen, did you watch it?
I did, yes.
Yeah. So they were definitely having a little issue, but it was specific to a Mac OS. They were using a Mac in order to podcast, and they seemed to eventually just roll with it. It didn't stop their show or anything. But yeah, it's noticeable that there are these little hiccups in Roadcasters that tend to rise up. I'm really curious now that they have the Rodecaster video, if the same sort of issues are going to start happening with people as they try to do their video switching and streaming. So that's going to be interesting to watch, right? Also, Joss Liston said, I haven't had an issue with my Rodecaster Pro 2 in 18 months-ish. And unfortunately, the reason is I stopped updating it when they released a stable version at some point in early 2023. I'm essentially just running with a, if it's not broken, don't update it philosophy, which is just sad, to be honest. I'd rather be able to explore to the new features and updates on a regular basis, but the risk of the unit crapping its pants when I'm recording, yeah, that's a visual there, when I'm recording just isn't worth the risk. Again, it's a shame it's come to this. Now, I think I mentioned in there, and if I didn't, I'm just going to mention it now, that I've been forced to upgrade both firmware on the Rodecaster Pro 2 itself and the Rode Central software in order to transfer files after I get done recording. And it's usually like on a Tuesday or Wednesday night, I just get done recording and I try to transfer it and say, no, you can't do it. You need to update your firmware or software. It's like, son of a, because I just want to transfer the files and get going. So the way Josh is using it might not be linked up that way. He might not be transferring files that way. And if you're not, I think you can get away with it. But if you do transfer files using the Rode Central software to open up the SD card to put it in transfer mode, to open up the SD card and move things over, you're not going to get away with it. They automatically force you to upgrade.
When are we going to get Generation 3?
I know. I get their desire to do the Rodecaster video, but if they would have made a Rodecaster Pro 3 that was stable, and maybe that's what they're doing, Stephen. Maybe we can hope that maybe they are beta testing the crap out of a Rodecaster Pro 3, and they have units out there that people are testing for like months, trying to ascertain stability issues and reliability issues. Maybe we can hope, but I just don't think that's the way they roll.
Can we get an alternative brand to actually give us like a real comparable product? Like, please.
Mackie we almost did.
Mackie
and then
was
Rode
the
bottom.
only one. Yeah. And it's like, you know, the Tascam Mixcast 4. Yes. The reason I stopped was because I was having some issues with the multi-track interface mode. But even putting that aside, it didn't have the same features as even the Rodecaster Pro 1. So it's like, it was close. It was very close. And there's some things I liked better about it, but it still wasn't an A to A alternative.
Yeah. So we'll see how this goes on. Yeah. Granted, this is a huge level of gear for the price available for us today that just wasn't available. for $10,000 15
Yeah.
years ago, I couldn't get anything that was like this, right? What was the TriCaster that was like $20,000 or $30,000 for the switching?
I'm not sure. I was waiting for that podcast equipment with a signature edition.
There's that too. So yeah, there's that TriCaster out there, which was an ability. It was a switcher, if I remember correctly. You could plug in different cameras and it would switch and be able to bring in guests via that way, even if it was on a monitor behind you, which I think was hokey as all crap. But it was available, right, for a certain price tag, and I think it was on the order of like $30,000. This and even the Rodecaster Video, orders of magnitude less, makes it more affordable to everybody. It's just a pain in the butt when the software craps out and it doesn't work, or in my case, when the hardware craps out and it doesn't work. So yeah, it hasn't been a panacea, and I think Rode wisely did a phenomenal thing, and they gave out all that gear for free. That just shut up any critics, because as we saw, there was very little criticism of the original Rodecaster until you mentioned some stuff. And then people started to talk about it.
Well, maybe in the future we'll be having another conversation. Maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Next year, when you think the gear cycle is going to be next year, in the summer around Podcast Movement, you think?
I don't know. I have no idea. I'd have to go look at the historical information.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I'm thinking we're looking at Podcast Movement plus or minus a month for when gear comes out next year.
I guess we'll see.
Yep.
But that's going to go ahead and take us towards the end of the show. Before we wrap up, we will remind you again, we've only got 2 more episodes after this one, and one of them is a gear show.
This year.
That's true. This year, fair point. So make sure you get your comments into us, because in all likelihood, there will only be one more recording session. If you don't get your comment to us before the next time we record, your feedback will probably have to wait to the new year. And that's a long time. It'll be dusty by then. It might be a little stale. So make sure you get your comments to us ASAP. Email podcast@betterpodcasting.com, or find all of our socials over at betterpodcasting.com/contact. I know it works. And check out our whole back catalog at betterpodcasting.com. And if you'd like to find some of the links to the things we discussed, if there are any applicable, you can always go to our website. For this episode is betterpodcasting.com/310. See, good practice.
Exactly. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. We would welcome your feedback, as Steven just said. And next time, on our last prepared segment of the year, we're going to be talking about archiving your show. So please get us your comments on that. If you have an opinion on how to archive your show, whether that's through archiving the files on your own storage, or whether that's archiving the show so it's available for everybody else. So that's what we're going to be talking about next time.
So for episode number 310 of Better Podcasting, I'm Steven, saying the L12 is still behind me, calling my name.
I'm SP, saying I hope everybody's having fun with your show. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for checking out another episode of Better Podcasting. You can find the full back catalog of Better Podcasting at betterpodcasting.com. If you're into geeky podcasts, please check out the other podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This show was produced and edited by Stephen Jondrew. Voice work was done by L.W. Salinas. Thanks again for listening or watching, and we hope to see you again next week.